Hello, good afternoon. This is Deborah Brown, and I am presenting today on students of African descent in secondary school, aka high school, U.S. history classrooms. This assignment is for Education 272, Qualitative Research Methods. So I'll begin with my research questions. As the image sort of shows, there is really a need to openly engage in conversation about what is being called the culture wars, and my research questions really speak to that sort of area of, I think, what's now burgeoning research. And so we're going to switch and look specifically about the research questions and talk a bit about why I selected them. So I do have 4 research questions altogether. And so when we get to the coding portion, I'll talk a little bit about ones that I highlighted or focused on for this first round of coding. But my 4 questions that I really focused on in the project, and I hope to focus on in my dissertation. 1, how do students of African descent describe their sense of belonging as it relates to their academic and social experience in the secondary school history or social studies classroom? Research question 2, to what extent does cultivating a sense of belonging and self-efficacy among students of African descent in middle school and high school social studies and history classrooms positively affect student learning? Research question 3, how do white supremacy and racism influence sense of belonging for students of African descent in secondary school history and social studies classrooms? And lastly, who are the most studied people of African descent in the U.S. history state standards in California? So for this particular assignment, I focused on research question number 3. How do white supremacy and racism influence sense of belonging for students of African descent in secondary school history and social studies classrooms? The last question really is a data-driven question that would look at the U.S. History state standards in California. And then the other 2 sort of are touched on, and you'll see that I will reference them when we talk about sense of belonging for my interviewees and really applied to the research. So why did I select these questions? I do feel like they are part of a longer story that is now coming up more and more often with the political rhetoric that is highly polarized around woke culture and what some people have now referred to as the culture wars. It goes back to an earlier moment that UCLA is centered with the historian Gary Nash, who really pushed to rewrite some of the state standards in the mid-90s. So 1994 was really part of those history wars, as they were referred to then. I would argue we still have continued and very focused conversation about history. And so that is one of the main focuses of this research. Also, because of my pretty extensive background in the history discipline, and currently I am a professor of history in the California Community College system, that really pushes me, sort of to do this work and what it's related to. So, 1, I wanted to, at the very least, bring up a definition that I use as a working definition of white supremacy. It is a definition that comes from the great Elizabeth, aka Betita Martinez, who was a Chicana feminist. She's actually one of 2 Latinas that were part of the original group of folks that were in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and she was a longtime community organizer. She passed in 2021, and this is a definition that she uses in her text. And she says, white supremacy is a system of exploitation and oppression of nations and peoples of color by white European peoples for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. And so that's really kind of the undergirding idea behind the work, behind the project. I'm going to kind of move forward. Recently, there was a book came out of Harvard called Teaching White Supremacy, where Daniel Iacovone, who is a professor of African and African American Studies writes about the way that American history is really focused on teaching an exceedingly white story. And so, again, all of those things have really fed into the research. And then, last but not least, a huge anti-critical race theory education model that we're dealing with. So there are over 36 states that have either enacted or attempted to enact legislation that would limit or outright deny the teaching of race in classrooms, and that includes, and really in certain states is specific to, the teaching of history. So the history of peoples of color, but specifically the history of Black people in the United States, of people of African descent. So again, part of the big push and part of really the culture wars. So now we'll move on to the data collection strategies. So here, briefly, I'll mention, here's a copy of my recruitment flyer. So you can kind of see that I was looking for students of African descent who had previously matriculated in high school U.S. history. I was not state specific, and I also allowed for a range of ages. Participants did receive the choice of an Amazon or a Target gift card upon completion of a one-on-one interview. And I also asked for an electronic writing prompt. I did not have them complete the writing prompt for this assignment, but I included it in the recruitment call. And in terms of the data collection portion, I spent 30 to 45 minutes, or scheduled that time. Some of the interviews actually went really quickly, so I'll come back to that at the end. They were held on Zoom. I used Otter AI on my phone for the transcription portion. And again, most of the recruitment went out to students at CSU or CCC, and I had access to them because they are students in my classes. So 2 of the interviewees did in fact participate in their interviews via Zoom on their phones, on their smartphones, and 1 student used their laptop. So my sample included 3 cisgendered females of African descent, ages 27 to 53. And in an effort to protect their identities and really to honor our African ancestors, I used traditional Ashanti and Fanti names as identifiers, because in West Africa, newborns are given special names that are specific to the day that they are born. I did use names based on the days that the interviews were conducted. So the pseudonyms were Afia, Fiba, and Akosua. So you'll see those in the interviews. And so here we move on to the coding portion. So as I engaged in pre-coding, and again, some pretty powerful images that I include in my PowerPoint. As I engaged in pre-coding, I really was struck by some of the things that that my interviewees talked about. So I'll try and go through these very quickly because I know I'm short on time. I feel like that was the moment where I realized, like, there's no one that cares. It just seems like the teachers don't care. And I think that's the moment I really started to check out of some of these classes. Check out, but like, less participation in everything because they didn't care. And so Fiba mentioned that in the interview. Afia mentioned I was traumatized a lot, so I couldn't really pay attention all the time. But what I did learn, I still carry. And then Fiba again mentioned in her interview, it was a couple of days of, they came over on the ships and they worked on the fields. It wasn't very glorified. They, enslaved people of African descent, wanted to be here in the USA. They have a better life here. And, knowing now that's not true. That really looking back at it, it was not fun in her reaction to history lessons. So 3 other quotes that really struck me as I was going through the pre-coding phase. I felt like my teachers only saw me as the color of my skin. And at that time, I was really dark and much, much darker than I am today. And I was always in the back of the class. I never, ever really felt a real connection to anyone at that school. And that was from Fiba. And then Afia mentions, I didn't understand until I got older what it really meant. But it really touched my heart to know that one of our ancestors was willing to accommodate and help our other ancestors to free them and for them to have the life that they deserve. And lastly, history of people of African descent needs to be introduced to our culture more frequently in every city, every state, everyone, because it's totally different in XXX county than the teaching of our ancestors, our history. So I think those were also really impactful, and that led to my first cycle coding method. So in terms of the coding that I used a deductive method focused on descriptive coding. I tried to use my interview questions and arguably used maybe a little bit of material that came from the interviews themselves. I didn't do two separate codes, but these are the items that showed up for me that appeared significant. One is belonging. Two, I asked specific questions about enslavement and slavery. 3, trauma, and 4, ancestors. And I added a separate code about history, but I'm really going to focus on these for today. And so here you can see some of the descriptive codes that came out of the work and how they were mapped. And so I picked quotes to highlight some of that mapping, and I'll read a couple here. So in terms of belonging, honestly, I never felt as I've never had a role model. I never felt like security or anything. I was very not educated about my Black identity. I was very insecure about it. So I put that in belonging, and I do think that impacted Okosua's experience in the classroom. And in terms of slavery, I asked a question specifically about slavery and whether they were taught that if it was morally wrong. And FIBA mentioned it was never taught in the class that slavery was morally wrong. Again, they did the whole thing. I had all-way history teachers all throughout from middle school through high school. They were like, yeah, people of African descent hear about this new place, and they got on the boats, and they came over, and they eventually got their freedom and everything. My mom was the one who taught us that slavery was wrong. So again, some impactful commentary that's being made here. And then here, Okosua talks about racism. There's a lot of racism, people calling you the N-word or like every name there is, and they think it's normal, like it's okay, it's acceptable. And then a number of folks who mentioned ancestors as they talked about items. So that was also mentioned in the pre-coding, and that was brought into. And then what did you learn throughout the process? One, I need to really adjust some terms for the interviews to ensure that my population understands the terminology. I want to also expand some of my questions to include more curriculum-specific questions and also include more demographic and warm-up questions, because I did think some of my interviews were shorter than I imagined they would be. And what might be your next steps? One, to improve those interview questions and map them better onto my research questions, and also conduct more interviews, because I think it was really impactful to see what was coming up for students. So with that, I will leave you with a little wisdom and knowledge and love from James Baldwin, and I appreciate any feedback on this presentation. Thanks so much.